The bridge of the Vorthak dreadnought was silent. 12 warriors stood in a circle, their armor etched with scars from 100 battles. Their reptilian eyes glowed with menace as they watched their latest prize, a human, unarmed, outnumbered. Yet he stood with a calm that unsettled even the most hardened among them. The largest of the warriors, Commander Zalvek, stepped forward. His voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Human, you are nothing. Weak, fragile. You will serve as an example to the rest of your kind." Dante Corvin, battle-hardened, fearless, tilted his head. A small, amused smirk played at the corner of his lips. "Fragile," he repeated. His voice was quiet, yet carried across the chamber with an edge of steel. Zalvek sneered. "Your weapons were confiscated. Your allies are gone. You stand alone." Dante exhaled slowly. Alone. But he had his sword. The warriors didn't know it yet, but they had already lost. Another warrior stepped forward, flexing massive claws. "The Dominion does not waste time with prey. Kneel, and your death will be swift." Dante didn't move. His gaze swept across the room. 12 adversaries, each stronger, taller, deadlier than any human. But strength meant nothing against skill. He flexed his fingers. His stance shifted ever so slightly. The warriors didn't notice. Big mistake. Zalvek's patience wore thin. "Enough of this." He raised a heavy, clawed hand and signaled, "Kill him." A warrior lunged. Dante moved. Steel sang through the air. The Vorthak froze, eyes wide in shock. A thin red line traced across his throat. A heartbeat later, his head hit the floor. The silence shattered. The warriors roared in fury. Dante smiled. "Now, we begin." The room erupted into chaos. The fallen warrior's body hadn't even hit the ground before the others reacted. Zalvek's eyes flared with fury. His command had been clear. This human was supposed to be prey, a fragile creature, an easy kill. Instead, the human had just executed one of their own with a single strike. That shouldn't have been possible. Dante stood amidst the carnage, his blade still dripping, his expression unreadable. One of the warriors growled. He had no weapon. Where did... Dante flicked his wrist, sending a droplet of dark Vorthak blood spattering onto the metal floor. "You never checked." The sword had been there the whole time, strapped to his back, hidden beneath the tattered remains of his combat vest. A simple carbon-forged monoblade, nearly invisible to the scanners, and now it was their problem. Zalvek clenched his fists. "Enough! Kill him now!" 4 warriors surged forward. Dante moved like a shadow, sidestepping the first attacker. His blade flashed. A severed arm hit the floor before the warrior even registered the pain. Another lashed out, claws aiming for Dante's throat. He ducked, twisting like a coiled spring, driving his blade through the warrior's gut and out. His back. The third one hesitated. Dante exploited it instantly. With a brutal spin, he yanked the sword free and brought it upward in a clean arc. The warrior's head split apart from the jaw, up. The fourth never even got the chance to attack. Dante was already on him, slamming the pommel of his sword into the warrior's knee. The alien crumpled, and a sharp, decisive slash ended him. Blood pooled across the metal floor. The remaining warriors stepped back. This wasn't just a fight, it was a massacre. Dante exhaled, adjusting his grip. "You should have done your research." One of the warriors snarled. "You're just a human." Dante tilted his head. "Am I?" Zalvek's claws twitched. He had vastly underestimated the human. This was no ordinary soldier. This was a killer. The Vorthak were warriors. They had conquered dozens of worlds. Their strength, their numbers, no species had ever bested them in single combat. And yet, here stood one man, one human, and they were the ones afraid. Zalvek's fury burned hotter. He refused to accept this. With a guttural roar, he charged. Dante didn't flinch. If Zalvek wanted to make this personal, then so be it. It would be his last mistake. Zalvek was fast. Brutally fast. His claws slashed through the air, aiming straight for Dante's throat. Dante twisted, narrowly dodging the blow. Metal screeched as Zalvek's claws tore through the reinforced walls. The force alone could have ripped a lesser being in half, but Dante was no lesser being. Zalvek came again, this time feinting left before lunging right. A trick, a kill move. Dante saw it coming. He dropped low, pivoting on his heel. The moment Zalvek's claws swept past, Dante struck. A perfect counter. His sword sliced cleanly through Zalvek's left forearm. A roar of pain erupted from the alien as black blood sprayed across. The floor, the warriors watching gasped. This was their leader, their strongest, and the human had just crippled him in seconds. Zalvek stumbled back, clutching his ruined arm. His breathing was ragged, his face twisted in rage. "You dare?" Dante lifted his sword, unfazed. "You came looking for a fight." He flicked the blood from his blade. "Now you have one." Zalvek's eyes burned with hatred. The human was toying with him. Unacceptable. With a roar, he lunged again, his remaining hand morphing into a jagged, bone-plated spear. A lethal mutation, one designed for impaling armored foes. But Dante was already moving. He sidestepped effortlessly, raising his sword in a smooth, precise motion. Then, with a single, devastating strike, he severed Zalvek's spear arm at the elbow. The limb hit the ground with a dull thud. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, Zalvek screamed. The mighty warlord collapsed to his knees, both arms ruined, black ichor pooling. Around him, Dante exhaled, rolling his shoulders. The fight was already over. The remaining warriors stared, horrified. They had believed their leader to be unstoppable, yet here he was, defeated, humiliated, broken. And the human hadn't even broken a sweat. Dante rested his sword against his shoulder, glancing around. No one else moved. Good. He took a step forward, crouching slightly so Zalvek could hear him. "You thought we were weak." Zalvek's breath came in ragged gasps. Dante's voice dropped lower. "Now you know better." For a moment, there was only silence. Zalvek knelt in the spreading pool of his own blood, his severed limbs twitching. The once mighty warlord gasped in pain, eyes wide with disbelief. His warriors stood frozen. They had never seen their leader fall, and they had never, not once, seen an enemy so calm after delivering such devastation. Dante exhaled slowly. One down. He turned his gaze to the others, eyes cold, calculating. How many more would make the mistake of testing him? The warriors hesitated, their instincts warring with their pride. Their leader was crippled, the human had barely moved, yet they were bred for battle. They could not, would not, retreat. A deep growl rumbled from the group. One warrior stepped forward, then another, and another. Dante counted 5, no, 6. Good. The first charged, a towering brute with armored plates fused into his flesh. He wielded a jagged war axe, its edge humming with energy. Dante shifted his stance. The brute swung, fast, powerful, sloppy. Dante stepped inside the arc of the swing, twisted, and drove his sword through the warrior's throat. The alien gargled, clawed at the blade, then crumpled to the floor. Another was already lunging, claws outstretched. Dante ripped his sword free and ducked. The warrior soared over him and met the tip of Dante's blade mid-air. It pierced through his chest with a sickening crunch. Dante yanked his sword sideways, splitting the alien open from rib to rib. The body fell in 2 separate halves, 4 left. They hesitated now. Fear seeped into their expressions. The human moved too fast, struck too precisely. They had expected a simple kill. Instead, they had walked into a nightmare. And Dante was just getting started. The next one tried to be clever. He circled to Dante's blind spot, hoping for a quick kill from behind. Dante smirked. Predictable, he pivoted just as the warrior leaped. A single stroke. The alien's head sailed through the air, his body collapsing a second later. 3 left. There. Breathing was ragged now. their claws flexing in uncertainty. Dante tilted his sword downward, tapping the tip against the bloodied floor. A slow, deliberate gesture. A dare. The remaining warriors snarled in unison. Then they attacked together. Smart. One feinted low, while another lunged high. The third stayed back, waiting to strike the moment Dante was distracted. It would have worked. Against anyone else, Dante sidestepped the low strike, twisted his blade, and drove it through the chest of the airborne attacker. His free hand lashed out like a whip. A brutal punch caved in the skull of the second warrior before he could recover. 2 heartbeats. 2 more down. The final alien stood frozen, alone. Dante slowly turned to him. The warrior trembled. He took a step back, then another. His mind screamed at him to run. Too late. Dante lunged forward, a blur of death. The last warrior barely had time to raise his weapon before steel flashed. A deep shk. The alien staggered. His eyes went wide. Dante stood behind him, sword outstretched. A second later, the warrior collapsed. His torso split diagonally, a clean, merciless cut from shoulder to hip. Silence. The battle had lasted less than a minute. Dante stood among the bodies, his breathing steady. The warriors, who had once stood so arrogantly, now lay in ruins. He turned his gaze back to Zalvek. The broken warlord stared in horror. This wasn't a warrior. This was a monster wearing human skin. Dante wiped his blade against his sleeve. "Next time," he said coolly, "choose your battles wisely." The scent of blood was thick in the air. It clung to the walls, seeped into the cracks of the floor, and settled in the lungs of the last surviving warriors. They had come here to crush a human. Now they were the ones being crushed. Dante stood, motionless among the bodies, his sword still wet. The steel gleamed under the dim lights, reflecting the horror in the warriors' eyes. None of them had spoken since the last body fell, because now, for the first time in their lives, they felt it. Fear. Zalvek, the once mighty warlord, trembled. His broken body twitched as he tried to crawl away, his severed limbs leaving streaks of dark blood across the floor. Dante's gaze locked onto him. Zalvek froze. His breath hitched, his instincts screaming at him to run, to fight. But he could do neither. Not against this. The human had slaughtered an entire squad of elite warriors, without effort, without mercy, without even breaking a sweat. The few remaining warriors backed away. Their claws, once so eager for combat, now hung limply at their sides. Their instincts, honed by centuries of battle, told them something they had never heard before. Run. But they couldn't. Their legs refused to move. Their lungs felt too tight, too small. The human wasn't chasing them. He wasn't advancing. He wasn't even speaking. And that made it worse. He just stood there, watching, cold, calculating, like a predator deciding whether to kill what remained or let them run so the hunt could continue. A warrior finally snapped. He bolted for the exit. It was not an act of strategy. It was raw, unthinking terror. He didn't care about honor, pride, or vengeance. He just wanted to escape, to live. But he didn't make it. Steel flashed. A heartbeat later, his body crumpled to the floor, a sword buried deep in his back. The other survivors stopped breathing. Dante walked forward, his boots squelching against the blood-soaked floor. He reached down, yanked his sword free, and flicked the blood off the blade. The motion was casual, effortless, as if killing was nothing more than an afterthought. A warrior dropped his weapon. Another fell to his knees. Eyes wide with surrender, Zalvek clenched his jaw. His body screamed in pain, but his mind screamed louder. This wasn't just a warrior, this wasn't even a human. This was something else, something worse. He had heard rumors, stories whispered by terrified soldiers. Humans were supposed to be resilient, tough, clever. But this was a nightmare in human form. Dante looked down at Zalvek. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, deadly. "Do you understand now?" Zalvek's throat went dry. He couldn't speak. He could barely think. Dante tilted his head, waiting. Zalvek forced himself to meet those eyes. The eyes of a man who had walked through death and come out the other side. A man who had faced warriors, warlords, entire armies, and survived. No, not just survived. Zalvek swallowed hard, and then slowly, painfully, he nodded. Because in this moment he knew the truth. They had never stood a chance. The battlefield was silent, not the silence of peace, but the silence of inevitable death. The last of Zalvek's warriors stood in a loose circle, their weapons trembling. In their claws, they had nowhere to run. Dante stood at the center, sword hanging at his side, his breathing slow, controlled. He didn't need to taunt them. He didn't need to threaten them. They already knew. This was the end. Zalvek forced himself to stand. His body screamed in protest, blood dripping from his wounds, but he clenched his fists and pushed forward. His pride wouldn't let him die cowering. If this was his last stand, he would make it count. He raised his weapon, leveling it at the human. "Finish this," he growled, voice hoarse but steady. Dante tilted his head. His expression was unreadable, but then he moved. A blur of motion. Steel sang through the air. A head fell before a body could react. The warrior to Zalvek's right dropped instantly, his eyes still frozen in shock as his severed body hit the floor. The others lunged forward in desperation. Dante was already gone. He weaved between them like a ghost, blade flashing, cutting through armor, bone, and flesh with effortless precision. One warrior tried to block. His arm separated from his body before he could react. Another swung wildly, only to find his strike deflected. His own blade sent plunging into his chest. Zalvek roared, charging, if he could land even one blow. Just one. Maybe the others would have a chance. He swung. Dante dodged. The human sidestepped the attack as if he had known it was coming before Zalvek even moved. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he carved a deep gash across Zalvek's leg. Pain shot through his body. His knee buckled. He hit the floor hard, gasping for breath. Around him, the last of his warriors fell, one by one, each death quicker than the last, until only he remained. Dante stepped closer, his boots echoing against the blood-soaked floor. Zalvek forced himself to look up. The human's face was calm. No anger, no hatred, just cold, efficient finality. "You fought well," Dante said. Zalvek laughed, bitterly. "We never fought at all," he rasped. The truth weighed heavier than his wounds. This hadn't been a battle. It had been a massacre. Dante raised his sword. Zalvek closed his eyes. And then, nothing. No pain. No final strike. Just stillness. Zalvek's eyes snapped open. Dante hadn't moved. His sword hovered inches from Zalvek's throat. "Why?" Zalvek whispered. Dante's expression didn't change. "Because I want you to live." Zalvek's breath caught. Dante knelt beside him, his voice low but firm. "You will tell them what happened here." Zalvek swallowed hard. He understood. Dante wasn't sparing him out of mercy. This was a warning, a message to anyone who dared to challenge humanity. And Zalvek, a once mighty warlord, now broken and humiliated, would be the one to deliver it. Dante stood. He turned, walking away, his sword still dripping with the blood of fallen warriors. Zalvek watched him go, watched as the human vanished into the darkness, and for the first time in his life, he truly feared mankind. Zalvek sat in silence. The War Council chamber was vast, filled with the most powerful leaders of his people. They had expected him to return in triumph, to recount his victory over the human warrior. Instead, he brought only shame and a warning. The others shifted uncomfortably, their eyes locked on the deep scar running down his leg, a wound that had already healed, but one that would never let him forget. Zalvek exhaled slowly, then spoke. "We were fools," the council murmured. Some scoffed, others leaned forward, sensing the weight in his voice. Zalvek continued. We believed humans were fragile, that their strength lay only in numbers, in their technology. His claws tightened into a fist. We were wrong. A low murmur spread through the chamber. "One man," he growled, his voice steady but laced with something unfamiliar, not rage, not defiance, fear. "One human with nothing but a blade," he continued, "and he tore through my warriors as if they were nothing." Silence. Zalvek let it linger, then he stood, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I was not spared out of mercy." He forced the words out. "I was spared so that I could stand here before you and deliver this message." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "Challenge humanity again, and there will be no survivors to tell the tale." The chamber was deathly still. No one spoke. No one laughed, because they all saw it. The fear in Zalvek's eyes, and they knew. The war was already lost. There are stories that inspire, stories that entertain, and then there are stories that warn. This was a warning. The alien warlords thought they understood strength. They measured power in fleets, in energy weapons, in the crushing weight of numbers. They saw humans as small, weak, insignificant, until one man, armed with nothing but steel and sheer determination, shattered that illusion. This wasn't just a battle. It wasn't just a victory. It was a statement, a simple, brutal truth burned into the minds of those who survived. Never challenge a Deathworlder in close combat, and never, ever mistake humanity's kindness for weakness. Because when the blades are drawn, when the fight becomes personal, humans don't fight to win. They fight to end you. This has been another tale from the far reaches of the galaxy, where humanity's legend grows with every battle fought. Like, subscribe, and remember, never underestimate a human.